I'd like to welcome author Cynthia Sylvester. She's a graduate of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College and the University of New Mexico. And her debut collection, The Half-White Album, is a UNM Press Lynn and Lynda Miller Southwest Fiction Series selection, showcasing works that focus on the Southwest experience. Cynthia, welcome. I'm going to take myself off the screen here and you can go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Many of you I know, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Cynthia Sylvester Yinishe, Kia Ani Nishle, Bilagana Bashishchin. I was born and raised in Albuquerque and Corrales, New Mexico, and like Jessica said, a graduate of the University of New Mexico over 30 years ago as an allied health professional. While working, I wrote this book and other things, novels, children's stories, more stories, poems, all things that we writers write and file away somewhere in the hope that one day it will all make sense. I'm so fortunate that Lynn and Lynda Miller, editors of the Southwest Fiction Series and the wonderful University of New Mexico Press, saw the sense I was making out of the pieces that are my debut book, The Half-White Album. As the narrator says in the prologue entitled Comfortably Numb, you could cue Pink Floyd here if you like. Her fingers tapped on the keys like ancient dancers of an even older ceremony performed only in the winter. Moccasin feet lightly touched the ground as her fingers tapped out stories, her songs, her prayers, her offerings. For how many nights, how many years had she sat and tapped on that keyboard? Her fingers walking a zigzagged path toward a medicine lodge at the base of the Red Mesas. This is my sand painting, this paper black on white. These pieces, poems, and stories are my songs that I offer to the night sky with the hope that at dawn, the ancient deities will see me, see us, and remember our names. I'm Kia Ani Nishle, Bilagana Bashishchin. Maybe she could walk between worlds. Maybe she could walk where lightning had struck and find that the path between black and white and this and that was just the zigzagged path of lightning. Find that they weren't cast out, but led to this side of the river and born into this place called Bosque, where the bell sits up high. It is on this zigzagged path that she wanders and I wander now and look up into the black sky of my heart, into the hole and wonder, will our losses ever be recovered, or is this hole an opening from where the journey begins? So I want to thank you for joining me on this first stop of my journey of this book. I think every book is a journey, and I really appreciate Jessica inviting me to be here with the Los Alamos Public Library System and Mesa Public Library in Los Alamos. Also in the prologue, the Half-White Album, two characters are introduced, a mother and a daughter. And though there's a cast of characters in this book, the mother and daughter provide a through line, as does place. Primarily, this book is set in the desert Southwest, but place is more than land or even landscape. It is also the path or the liminal space that many of the characters find themselves on, looking for a place called home. Again from the prologue. She put the book down and typed home. She wrote that home smelled like dust and dogs and sweetbread and caressed soap. She wrote that it was a place that knew her better than she knew it. She wrote about the fragrances of Russian olive trees in the spring and alfalfa in the summer, of wood smoke and coffee at dawn, about the sound of sheep bells and the barking of old dogs, about black crows and arrows and shadows, about being dead and not knowing it. Home for me, being Diné, has to do with mother. The Diné are a matriarchal society, so home signifies my clan and my place in the Diné Ta. The Diné Ta is what many refer to as the Navajo reservation, but it's not a reservation. It's a place beyond boundaries set by the government and extends to me who has never lived within the four sacred mountains of the Diné. To someone like me who found her home out here and in other parts of the country. But my home is here. I was born to my mother's 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 mother's. It was very important to me to begin the book there. back to the place I've never lived, back toward a woman who I never got to meet, my grandmother. The inspiration for the first two poems and the first story in the collection are based on her. I can't imagine what pain and what strength and endurance she had to watch her children be taken from her to go to boarding school, to be raised by other people who didn't share her beliefs, her language, which forms our beliefs and philosophies, and be told that she was not capable. They were more capable than her to raise her own children. And at this point, I have to make a shout out to some friends from Warren Wilson. We have a critique group, and they read a portion of this book and when I was restructuring it. And I wanted too many things out of this story. And they are so smart that they told me, you're wanting too many things out of this story. And so I listened to them. And so what I did was I broke the story up into two poems that open the book, I mean, other than the prologue, and then a short story that's told in the point of view of a woman who was living in the early 1900s with colonization and acculturation underway. Acculturation was a strategy of the government to get rid of Indians, to change us, change our beliefs, take our language and our stories. So this one I've written for her. The first poem is I Might Have Been Queen. There are no words in this language to translate her name, a name that stretches back to the time with no time, then flashes forward 10,000 years. But you should know that her name is like the warm touch of fingers on your forearm when you're afraid or lost. That it smells like a late spring morning in the valley when the Russian olives are in bloom, the coffee done perking. It tastes like the fatty edge of meat butchered with the knife of a warrior, salty and crisp, flecked with bits of sand that stick between our big front teeth. Sand that blows across the dunes over by the old house, uncovering pottery shards that refuse to remain buried. And then the next poem is called Boulevard of Broken Dreams. With a blanket across her broad shoulders and a shawl covering her head, with ants dreaming still furled on cool sand, sprinkling corn pollen on the path ahead of her, she walked. Past the well where the old buzzard still slept, his head tucked under a molted wing, across the dunes towards the hills emerging from shadow, she walked. Focusing her mind on moist yellow corn tassels from the abundance of rain in a summer that was almost past now, she walked. Shawl tied around her ears, not against the chill of dawn, but from the thoughts that crept in like the day was creeping over the hills, she walked. And despite the beauty above her, below her, the beauty all around her, her thoughts turned to the smoke that walked beside her. Smoke she tried to push away, to think away as she walked. Across the dunes to her field of plenty, she walked. So there's those two poems, and then the story, I'll read about the first 2 pages of the story called The Last One. Shema had started at dawn harvesting, cutting, then grinding kernels of corn into sweet paste. Now she patted the last of the gooey substance into husk, folding and tying the loaves of bread with tired fingers. She stood slowly, hips and knees sore from kneeling for so long. She looked to the east, hoping to see her husband on his way home. It was work that was supposed to be done with other women, with her daughters, with laughter and song. But her relatives weren't able to come and help, and all her daughters were away. She hadn't complained that her husband was leaving too, making the overnight trip to the trading post. He had taken some of their goods, sheepskin, wool, and 2 blankets she'd woven to trade for winter stock. She wasn't upset that he'd left at this time when the corn was still young and juicy enough to make bread, because he promised that on his way home, he'd stop at the mission boarding school and check on their daughters. She was anxious to hear how they were, especially her youngest. Nothing moved on the horizon. The sparrows held still in the sagebrush. The lizards lazed on hot rocks. Even her sheepdogs, a crew of 3 mutts, were too hot to chase rabbits into their holes. They dozed under greasewoods that provided growing shade as the sun laid down its head on the red mesa. As if on cue, the breeze that always came up with the sunset rustled her long skirt, reminding her in its tickle of cloth on leg to stop worrying and finish the bread before it got dark. To emphasize that point, the old buzzard that hung around at the well began his slow descent. his hollow bones hopefully warm enough to make it through the cool August night. Shema picked up the shovel and stirred the coals in the pit fire she built at noon. The embers were hot. She removed the larger chunks of wood and placed them on a flat piece of metal she'd found several years ago, half buried in the sand dunes. It was a hood of an old car. She and the mule her youngest had named Held pulled it out and drug it home. As she looked at her earthen oven, Shema thought about her daughter and what her daughter had told her, that the kitchen at the boarding school was the only thing she liked, that and the radio in the basement where she worked doing laundry. She said the radio crackled like a fire and hummed with songs that came from far away. And the ovens lit with the snap of fingers. She said they made bread with sugar and yeast, bread that rose up like a big moon over the side of the bowl. Shema kneeled at her earth oven, looked at her bread made from ground corn. It had been all-day work, and she had 6 dozen loaves that looked like faceless dolls, maidens in stiff dresses. She picked up a loaf, looked at it, and said, "Are you little ladies going to rise like the moon under this old hood?" Her face burned, and she squinted her eyes against the heat that immediately curled the bottom of the maidens' dresses as she laid them side by side. Shema hummed a song, adding it to the bread. As the sun descended slowly, her song was a sort of lullaby to the little corn husk ladies, as if they were her children. One by one, she put them in the oven, just as her own children had been taken to the mission school, one by one. Shema had 6 daughters, and she had named the last one, the last one. She did this because she swore that that child would be the last one that she'd push out into this world just to be swallowed up by the missionaries or the government. It's not as if she didn't understand that they had to go to school. It's that they took them with the purpose of changing them. Yes, we all change, she agreed with her husband when they argued about the boarding school, but it was how they changed. Each time she took a child there to live, she studied them, tried to remember what they had been like, because the next time she saw them, their long hair would be cut short, their long skirts and blouses with silver buttons would be replaced with short light blue dresses, their faces no longer full, their eyes distant. The last one was born ornery and independent, so much so that she was more often than not in trouble at home. She'd get on a horse that wasn't yet broken or take the sheep farther than told, so that she and the sheep didn't get home until well after dark. Shema thought that the last one would face her new future with that same bravery. But instead, when Shema took her to the school, she clutched Shema's leg and buried her face in her skirt to hide her tears. Shema had knelt in front of her and whispered into the top of her sweet, sweaty head. Shh. She had pointed to the mesa that was behind her now. If you stand right here and look that way, see, right there, that's where you're from. You'll see the smoke from my fire, and I can see you, so be good, be strong, she told her and herself. Little did she know that her daughter would stand at that spot every day looking for smoke. So that's the first couple pages of that story. This collection is a combination of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. That story is fiction, but it explains how I got here, how I came to be born in Albuquerque, and why my mom and my family lived here. We are products of the system of acculturation. It was important to my grandfather, my Cheche, for his children to learn this language. My mother told me, he said, I can only go so far because I don't know their language. My mother, who was a wonderful nurse, wanted to go back and get her bachelor's degree in nursing, but didn't because she didn't think she knew English well enough. And she spoke English very well. So I made it a part of my path, my journey, to master this language as best anything can be mastered by getting my degree in writing at the wonderful program for writers at Warren Wilson College. So now that I'm here in this place, that's where the book goes to, flashing forward to contemporary times, but with characters who still find themselves between worlds. The press release for the book sent out by UNM said the collection is humorous, heartbreaking, and rooted in the desert Southwest. So far, I've offered you heartbreak and the desert. So I'll switch gears a bit and move into the greatest survival mechanism, and one used by my family on both sides, humor and storytelling. This is one of my favorite stories from the collection. It's called Do You Want to Dance? There are several returning characters in the book: the daughter, the mother, Ruth, and Ruth's friend and colleague, Dolores. Ruth and Dolores worked together as RNs at the Indian Hospital in Albuquerque. There's a huge legacy of nursing coming out of the Diné. The boarding school my mom attended was built by Presbyterian missionaries, and one of them was a doctor. And so there was a hospital built and a nursing program. My mom got her passion for nursing there, but the program closed before she graduated high school. So she went to Southern Methodist Hospital in Dallas to get her nursing degree. It was sort of an exchange program, so several of her friends went as well. And my father was in the Navy and stationed in Galveston, and that's how they met, where they met, and that's how we became half white. But she was in the first wave of Diné women who went into medicine, maintaining a legacy of being a medicine woman. They had the powers bestowed upon them by their education in nursing, as well as their natural powers of healing people. This is from the story, Do You Want to Dance, originally published by Lunch Ticket. This is a part of the story, not all of the story. Do you want to dance? Dolores stood beside Ruth in the two-car garage, their polarized trifocals not yet adjusted to the darkness. Dolores wore a sun visor from the 2010 New Mexico Bowl game, where the Lobos had lost miserably. Ruth had on her fishing hat with numerous fishing flies dangling from it. She was so tall and skinny, she looked like a floor lamp. Above the buzz of the flickering fluorescent shop light that hung from the ceiling, there was another buzzing sound. What's that smell? Dolores said, crinkling her nose. But she already had a feeling. She knew Ruth had caught something. Ruth pointed to the hefty trash bag lying on the concrete floor. A few large horse flies were buzzing around it, and the smell of wet mud, algae, and a wound that needed a dressing change rose from the green bag. Is this why you call me? Dolores asked. She shook her head. I knew you were up to something, she added in their native tongue. She said this because normally Ruth didn't call for Dolores to come over to her house. Usually they went somewhere together, basketball games, the casino. Once in a while, Ruth, who had retired several years earlier, would meet Dolores for lunch at the University Hospital cafeteria. She was fond of the liver smothered in greasy onions and the peach cobbler. So when Ruth had called her around lunchtime that day and asked her to stop by, even though Dolores lived nowhere near Ruth, she knew something was up. When she arrived, Ruth was standing in the doorway to her large ranch-style house. She waved her long, thin arm above her head and left the door open for Dolores to enter. The tea kettle whistled and steam filled the yellow sponge-painted kitchen. Ruth had already placed 2 coffee cups on the orange Formica countertop. Ruth smiled at her friend and said, "How are you?" "Fine," Dolores said as she placed a Safeway shopping bag on the counter and pulled out Little Debbie's sweet rolls. Ruth got out 2 plates and Dolores cut them each a generous portion. "How was your trip to Bloomfield?" Dolores's granddaughters played in summer softball league. Her team had made it once again to the state tournament, played near her granddaughter's home in the Four Corners near Shiprock. Ruth poured water into each cup and held up a box of Christmas spiced tea, even though it was August, and a red container of Folgers instant coffee. Dolores pointed with her lips towards the coffee, and Ruth set it down on the counter beside 2 spoons. "We came in second." Dolores's grandkids always came in second in the girls' 2A district basketball tournament, second in the elementary school spelling bee, second in the fancy dance contest. Even Dolores had come in second in the quilt show at the county fair. We got beat by the Bloomfield Sunflowers, a team of freckled-faced farm girls whose team was sponsored by the Future Farmers of America. The Shiprock Screaming Eagles were sponsored by Moe's Transmission Shop and the Chat and Chew. Dolores picked up a spoon and a plate with a frosted sweet roll and followed Ruth to the kitchen table. The sun streamed in the window that faced south, and their trifocals became lightly polarized. The window, wide and low, looked out across what used to be a back lawn, a dirt alley that used to be an irrigation ditch, into Sophia Martinez's yard and quite nearly into her house. But they could stare into Sophia's house all they wanted because she was blind. She'd been going blind when Ruth and her family moved into their newly constructed home nearly 40 years ago. Now it was Ruth who was going blind. She had been told a couple months ago she had the beginnings of glaucoma. She was keeping it a secret from everyone, including her nosy daughter. "Is that Junior?" Dolores said, then took a big bite of sweet roll as she looked out the window at him, a thin man hoeing 2 rows of corn. Bent over his shoulder blades seemed to be pointing at them from across the barbed wire fence. Ruth didn't even look up from her cup where she was bobbing her tea bag. The doctor had told her to stop eating so much chocolate and drinking so much coffee due to her ulcer. "That's Junior. He's getting too skinny," Dolores said, and looked over her glasses at Ruth, meaning Ruth, was getting too skinny. "Here, eat one of these." She pushed a plate toward her friend and continued to stare at Junior. "He's no future farmer," she said, and took another bite as he continued to hoe and Ruth continued to bob. Ruth pointed to a centerpiece on her cluttered kitchen table. It was colored Indian corn, 4 pieces tied together with a string, so that if she wanted, she could hang it on her front door. "He made that for me, Dolores. He made that for me." Dolores held it up. Each cob was hardly larger than the size of corn in a Szechuan Chinese meal. She said something in Diné about him not planting the seeds deep enough, and then put it back on the table amid newspaper clippings, crossword puzzles, a horoscope book, a doll's dress Ruth had been mending 2 years ago, and a racing form. Ruth opened a pack of sweet and low, stirred it into her tea, and said something that wasn't discernible above the rattle of the swamp cooler. Dolores began to mix some instant coffee. "What?" Ruth slid a newspaper toward Dolores and pointed at the headlines with one long brown arthritic finger. She then held her hands tightly together in front of her, as if she were a child saying a desperate prayer. Clutching her hands was the only way she could keep her long fingers from moving like the legs of a spider, and her arms from flying open as if she were conducting an orchestra. Dolores picked up the paper that was dated several weeks past and read, "Prosthetic leg found in Corrales ditch." This was not news to Dolores. Ruth had come by her house early last week. In fact, she had driven all the way into town just to tell her about the leg that had been found in the ditch near her home. But more importantly, to tell her that she thought she knew who it belonged to. "Who?" Dolores had asked. "You know, he was in the hospital, the one that was in the rodeo." Dolores closed her eyes and saw him, a good-looking, tall young man who rode bulls. He'd been thrown not from his bull, but from the back of a Ford pickup truck. The x-ray of his femur looked like bone that had been broken into new galaxies. He had cried like a child when they dressed his wound following the amputation. "I can't ride bulls anymore," he told the 2 nurses that saw their sons, both born and unborn, in him. "I can't dance." Dolores looked up from the paper and back out at Junior. He was working on the next row. She briefly wondered if Ruth had forgotten that she already had shown her this, but she knew better as Ruth's fingers began to tap the table, the vein on the back of her hand moving side to side like a snake. She took another bite of sweet roll, chewed slowly, slipped loudly, and trying to sound uninterested, said, "Did they find the rest of him?" Ruth slid another paper toward Dolores and tapped a column on the left-hand side, page B6, next to the advertisement for Discount Tire. The prosthetic leg had indeed been found and identified, and indeed did belong to a Navajo male who lived in the Albuquerque area. However, local law officials were unable to locate the owner. That's when Ruth had got up, and without asking, Dolores followed her through the laundry room with its sweet smell of dryer sheets and tide to the garage, where they stood now, looking at the hefty trash bag. It's his other leg. So that's where I'll leave that story, cliffhanger. So the ranch style home that Dolores and Ruth are in features prominently in the book, both in fiction and nonfiction pieces. A thread in the book is the daughter of Ruth. Hers is a life along that zigzagged path, but where that path so often leads her is to this house. She wants to think that it's because she's caring for her mom and that it's just a temporary situation when she breaks up with another girlfriend. But as the narrator says, in different ways, she's always been there, even when she was gone. The daughter's journey is like many of the characters. She's occupying liminal spaces between cultures, and because she's two-spirit in her coming out story, or more like dragged out story called Into the Mystic, the daughter is reminded of the powerful Nadle, the Diné, the two-spirit person who before The coming of the missionaries was a respected member of the clan and tribe. This next story is about her awakening as a child and knowing that she's different and how she knew that that was not okay. So this is a flash fiction called Personal Jesus. When I was little, I used to take holding on to things literally. For instance, I fell in love with my neighbor, Missy. Missy resembles Cindy Brady from the Brady Bunch. One afternoon, after watching Dark Shadows at Missy's house, we went to play in Missy's bedroom. Missy had a tiny bowling set complete with a miniature bowling ball that she kept on her dresser. I loved the little set nearly as much as I loved Missy. But even at the age of 6, I knew this love may not be returned. So I took a memento, one of the pins. What better way to keep Missy next to my heart than in a cigar box beneath my bed? That's why small things that might be missed but couldn't be found began to disappear around our house, like my sister's troll doll, a tube of lipstick from my mom's purse, a belt buckle I'd found in my dad's drawer. It must have been from when he was in the Navy because it had a mermaid and an anchor on it. My fear was that catastrophe could strike at any time. Fire in the middle of the night, burning up the house and my family, a car accident while my parents were driving home from eating out, a punctured lung as someone fell off their bike wrong, drowning, kidnapping, someone running away and leaving me behind. I was pretty sure that if the good Lord showed up in the middle of the night or on a sunny afternoon, it would not be with cherubim and seraphim riding noisily into our lives, but more like how my second cousin Avis arrived, unannounced. But unlike cousin Avis, who was very visible, who required a kiss on her stubbly chin and assistance in pulling her oxygen tank in the house, God would come in undetected and ride away with the soul. Vigilance was required. I prayed and I held. Some nights, for effect only, I would kneel in front of my twin bed, hands squeezed together, gazing up at the popcorn ceiling that had tiny specks of glitter embedded in it. I strived to look pious, like the little girl I'd seen on a Christmas card, except I wasn't blonde or cute like Missy, and I didn't have a Christmas tree in my bedroom. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I couldn't have Missy, if God took her away, which he did in the 2nd grade to Texas, I had the tiny bowling pin. Or if a school bus drove over our beagle, I had her new chew toy. And my dad's belt buckle, call me telepathic. I wondered if he missed it as much as I missed him. And if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. I think he did, a little bit at a time. So that's that story was written years ago for Dime Stories. My friend Jennifer Simpson began Dime Stories in Albuquerque years ago. Dime Stories are 3-minute stories, prose, fact, or fiction, written and read by the author. And it fit perfectly into my working life and the life of helping to take care of my mom when she had gotten, when she got sick. So 500 crafted words was something I could achieve in a month. And several of the stories in the collection were written for Dime Stories. As I said at the beginning, it took well over a decade to write the stories and poems in this collection. I would write with different groups, Southwest Writers Workshop with Betsy James. We wrote in the back of a garage, car garage. And that's where I initially started Pineywood Hills. I workshop with Lynn Miller and Lisa Leonard Cook. And that's where I wrote Wild Horses and revised Pineywood Hills. In 2011, I won the Native Writer Award for the Taos Writers Conference and had the privilege of working with 4 wonderful poets led by Joy Harjo. And that's where the poem, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, comes from. The list of places that I studied at over the years, the writers and poets I studied with and wrote with, and where we all work to improve our craft grows. The penultimate was giving myself the gift of attending Warren Wilson. But I had all these stories. I had all these stories before I began my MFA program in 2016. And there I worked on a novel and didn't work on any of this at all. So when I graduated, I had to come back and I had to work on this book because it was so important to me. but I didn't really know how to put it together. I had two collections, a chapbook and I had a short story collection. And I was struggling on what to do. I thought, well, I'll just keep them separate. And then the pandemic hit and the stress levels rose, of course, for all of us. And when we were finally able to get out, the first thing Kim, my wife, and I did was we went camping with my sister and some of her, friends. And she made cowboy margaritas and I had quite a few. And so then that night, high up in the cold mountains of the Colorado in a tent, I woke up in a dream and I was walking to a bookshelf and there were two books. One wasn't titled and one was. It was by one of my favorite authors, Elizabeth Strout, and it was called It's All One Story. And I woke up immediately and I told Kim, I said, it's all one story. And so I went home and I got both collections out and I took out everything that wasn't regional, that didn't fit in the story that is this book, and structured it on a ceremony, a very, very old Diné ceremony. And once that was done, I needed to remove the scaffolding of the ceremony. And the book was strong enough to hold without that. And I added created a band, the covers, to lead us through 10 chapters, which are live concerts. So I guess what I've learned through all of this, is that writers, we often worry about when we'll get published, where we'll get published, who publishes us, and so on and so forth. But this book, I know, couldn't have come out at any other time and in any other place. So I'm just very privileged to be able to talk about it and read some from it. So that brings me to one last, a poem, prose poem, a little flash something, but it brings us back to place. And I'll end with this piece from the last chapter, which is called Live at the House Made of Dawn. Dust in the wind. Out on the horizon, there's a place where the warp of red sandstone meets the weft of blue sky. Strands of asphalt are woven with threads of dirt road. Long brown fingers wipe a child's greasy smile with a white paper napkin, and then place that smile in the rug she is weaving, along with the sound of a barking dog, thunder, and the soft whisper of rain on sand dunes. On days when my memory and my good thoughts are like dust that flew away, I go outside and listen to the wind. She carries our stories back to me across wide waters and sand dunes in the form of small white clouds that race toward me and burst through the wooden screen door like a child chasing her dog. In the waves of wind that bend the huge elm trees around my home, I hear my cousins laughing. In the center of those clouds is rain and the sound of our mothers gossiping with one another again. I smell wet dirt and sagebrush. I look down and see that I've tracked mud onto the rug. My footprint is the place I call home. The place where we are woven in is no longer the mistake, but the place in the rug that makes it perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. We've got a ton of compliments in the chat box. I'm not sure if you have that up on your screen, but I can read some to you. Great storytelling, Cindy. So enjoying your powerful reading. Marvelous, congratulations. Such wonderful writing. And on and on. I want to second that. That was actually a really it was really wonderful. You're obviously really talented and an artist. So thank you for sharing with us. I want to let everybody know that Cynthia has some other things coming up before we get to the Q&A. She's got a book launch happening called The Half White Show, which will be taking place on April 15th at Tortuga Gallery in Albuquerque. And she'll be reading from her book again there, but there will also be music by a band that was assembled solely for this purpose. Is that right? Called the Half White Band. And I actually want to share a picture of it with everyone because it looks so fun. So give me one second here. So there she is. But what I'll do is tomorrow, I've got all your email addresses, everyone who registered for this program, and I will email that flyer out to you in case anyone is interested in attending. And then I also will include some information about some airtime that she is going to be enjoying. So there's an interview airing on Right On Four Corners, hosted by Delcherie Gladden. That's a radio show on KSJE at San Juan College. And that is also going to be aired as a podcast of the same name, Right On Four Corners. So I'll go ahead and include that in an email to you tomorrow as well, in case you're interested in exploring any of this further. And again, we've got her book at the library, but only one copy. So most of you are going to have to go out and buy it. And with that, let's go head into the Q&A. Unless, Cynthia, would you like to mention anything about the show, your book launch?
No, I think that sums it up. There'll be some refreshments, free food, and drinks. It's always good. So yeah, it's doors open at 6. The show starts at 7. Yeah, and it'll be about an hour long, something like that, you know. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's go to the Q&A. And actually, we've got one question in here I don't want to miss. What is a cowboy margarita?
Right. Well, I don't really know. All I know is that they're really good and they're really strong, especially when you're up at that altitude. My sister made them, and they're in a Ziploc bag, you know, and so I guess you make them ahead of time and you put them in your cooler, and she just had several bags of those, and we managed to get through them that weekend.
Glad we got that cleared up. All right. I'll start us off with another question here. And then for everyone else who's interested in asking a question, feel free to type it into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask something. Just be careful not to talk over each other if you do. So my question to you is, words by a wide range of artists, musicians, and writers introduce each concert, these 10 stories you talk about in your book. Can you talk about how you chose them and why?
Well, each chapter sort of has I don't want to say a theme, but in my mind, there's something that chapter's trying to do. So for instance, the chapter that has, do you want to dance? And I probably should look this up. Yeah, Live at the House of Red Clay is that one. And so at the very beginning, so this one, you know, there's stories in here that are a lot about like restoring your body, restoring yourself to yourself, in a sense, restoring your soul to yourself in different ways. There's a couple stories about two-spirit people in here. And so I picked, like, for instance, Elton John. He's two-spirit. The great thing about rock and roll is that someone like me can be a star, you know, so, which I think is great. And then bell hooks. Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. So the idea of the book really, too, is that this is a way, you know, it's, to me, music has always been very healing. I can go to a concert, doesn't matter what it is. It could be ZZ Top, it could be whatever. And it's very, very healing for me. And I think the combination of music and storytelling and is extremely powerful. So that's kind of how it kind of each section in my mind had somebody that kind of spoke to that chapter. So
thanks, Cynthia. We've got another question here. This is from Mona. I love it that you listened to your dreams message, letting you know your writing projects were all one book. Did you grow up trusting your intuition and messages like this, or did it take a while to develop that trust?
Yeah, no, I have. I mean, at my advanced age, I'm finally beginning to trust myself. I will say, though, that I do believe the things that I feel. I just sometimes intellectually then can't really act on them, but I know them to be true. But I do think now I am very, very much more aware of what a gut feeling is, or even when something comes to you in a dream, that it is important and you need to listen. And actually, after that dream, I had a couple more dreams about this book, and I listened to what was in the dream. So yeah, but it took me a while. I was too busy praying and holding to think about listening to anything, any kind of actual real guidance, you know.
Did those dreams come before or after you attended Warren Wilson?
After like I've been with this book. I mean, many of the people here have written with me. Hilda Raz read the chapbook. So did Phyllis. There's, people here that have like listened to it in different versions. And so what was important about Warren Wilson was that I understood structure, whereas before I didn't understand what that meant. I just wrote when I could write, and I didn't really understand anything too much about structure specifically. I was trying to find ways, and Hilda was helping me find ways to link stories and poems together, and that was kind of holding together, but not so much. So really that's made a huge difference and then made a huge difference when I removed the structure itself and had, and was like, okay, now how is it going to hold up? And then it just kind of came, again, another idea came. So I think it's after being with the book for so long. And honestly, like I said in my acknowledgements, I mean, I feel like, I have a lot of endurance. I have a lot of ability to just do this work, and that's what it takes. And so I'm very fortunate that I was sitting here when these stories, came to me, and people, my ancestors, whispered to me in the wind these stories, and that I know is to be true. But I did have to sit here, and I did have to be here, and I did have to figure out how to make them better stories than the first ones that came out. So
I'm super excited to read your book. Actually, I'm sure a lot of people here are. We do have another question in the chat box here for you. Cecile says, you mentioned Elizabeth Strout, but I was wondering if there are other writers who've influenced you directly. Who were your faculty mentors in graduate school, if you don't mind saying?
Well, I'll start with my faculty members: Antonia Nelson, who wrote a blurb for this book, David Haynes, T. Geronimo Johnson, and Karen Brennan. All quite different. Yeah. And so, yeah. And of course I worked on my novel. I didn't work on any of this. It's what Warren Wilson wants you to do, is to not bring old work, but make new work. And so that's what I did. But it was just, kind of, I will say this to Mona's question too. I had this terrible fear that if I didn't get this done, and my novel too, which is very important to me, I would, I know this is dark and terrible, but like if I were to pass away, which I'm sure I will at some point, right? And I didn't get these done, I would be stuck here because I wouldn't be able to go across, because my work here wasn't done. So that's really how important this is to me. So now I've got the one, and I don't know, but so anyway, then the other part, oh yeah, I mean, Joy Harjo is probably my greatest influence. I love her book, her Secrets from the Center of the World, which also has photographs and poems. They're just beautiful about the Diné, the Navajo reservation, or Navajo land. I loved Flannery O'Connor. She has that wonderful dark humor. So she was always one of my favorites. And then when I was a kid, I wanted to be a detective, and I always read like The Three Investigators and, Alfred Hitchcock type books. And so I think there's a, kind of a, humorous and maybe a little bit of darkness that runs through some of my stories. So, but yeah.
Thanks, Cynthia. So you mentioned you were working on a novel, which is separate from this book you're here to talk about tonight. And it sounds like what you're saying is you're still working on that, so we can expect another book from you in the future.
I hope so, yeah.
Okay, great.
15 years. I mean, I'm working on it. I think I've been working on that for about 5 now, so I'm going to try and up my speed a tiny bit, right? But it's, again, it is when it comes out, it's when it comes out. I mean, I can't be more happy with this book, and I think time was a huge part of it. So.
Mhm. Yeah, I really hear the artistry in it. I don't know much about literature, but I am I'm a fine artist myself. I was trained in two-dimensional art, but yeah, I can hear it in your reading. It just I'm just again just super excited to read it. So there's another question here from Samantha, and she says, can you tell us what you learned about structure?
Well, that you need some. You need structure. There's that. You know, honestly, I'm not the most articulate person when it comes to craft talks. But I will say that knowing that, having in my mind what the structure of this book was, once I had that dream, it was very, very easy to place the stories within that structure, within that ceremony. So I think once you find the structure, like say, for instance, in my novel, it was just all over the place and still is all over the place. But one of the ways that it's structured is on the type of point of view that I've chosen first to open the book, and then how it shifts in the main body of the book and then returns to that point of that narrative distance at the end of the book. And because it's about a team, a basketball team, I think that was really helpful. And Antonia Nelson was actually the one who kind of showed that to me. It was there. And I think sometimes with structure, if you're too close to it, or it's you might create it, but you don't really see it. And so especially if someone can point something out to you, and then once you're like, oh yeah, I see that now, and I see why you're doing it. Because I think innately as artists, you know about structure. You just have to maybe figure out that you got it or don't, whichever the case may be. Yeah.
Great. Well, this has been an engaging crowd here. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? Looks like that might have been the last one.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It means so much to me. So thank you.
Absolutely. We really enjoyed having you. So thanks again for making the time to do this for the library. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We'll see you all.
Take care. Good night.